Okay, so we have our last panelist, and the clock has just gone 1 o'clock, my time in any case, so I think it's a good time to start. You're all very welcome to this session on seasonal scenario planning for matching seed supply and demand. In the main, this session will be moderated by our good colleagues from the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT. But first, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Gareth, who's going to help contextualize this session and the activities we're going to talk about within the GSST Africa community of practice. Okay, so Gareth, over to you. Welcome. And again, yep, good, you have your microphone active. Over to you, Gareth.
Great, thanks very much, James. And indeed, my appearance today is just a cameo one. I look forward to watching from the sidelines. Jonathan will be moderating. And it's my role just as the representing the sponsors of the work, just to give a little bit of background to what that sponsorship means. So I'm actually here representing Wageningen University and Research, the organization to which I belong, and the GSST Africa Community of Practice topic on creating demand for quality seed. Behind the topic is a coalition of partners led by Wageningen University and Research. James, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So a little bit of a background to the problem statement and the objectives of the GSST Africa topic on creating demand for quality seed. What we observe in sub-Saharan Africa is limited use of quality seed and low rates of turnover of new and improved varieties, and yields that lag behind other regions in the world. And all of this despite the billions of dollars invested to date in crop improvement programs. The objective of the coalition behind the topic is not only to increase demand to match current levels of supply, but also to better match supply with what farmers really want. James, can you go to the next slide? And to that end, the GSST Africa topic conducts a number of action learning activities to answer the following questions. What knowledge do stakeholders need to better understand seed markets and demand? What works when promoting quality seed use? And how can we influence the policies, strategies, and practices of stakeholders that are applied to create demand for quality seed? So one example of an action learning activity is the research that the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT will present here today, which explores the use of seasonal scenario planning in matching seed supply and demand. This and other activities of GSST Africa are funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, the Netherlands government, and several others. Many organizations collaborate under the topic of creating demand for quality seed, as you can see by the logos here on this page. And for more information, please visit our website. Thanks very much, James. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Thanks, James, for the introduction. So welcome, everybody. I see there's 68 people in the room. Awesome. My name is Jonathan Steinke. I work for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. And today we're going to present some work in progress. So we have things to say, but we also have things to ask. And really looking forward to some interaction with the audience, which is why I'm particularly happy there are so many people in the room. So we'll speak about seasonal scenario planning and how we believe it could help to match seed supply and demand in the smallholder sector in Africa. Next slide, please. So what we basically see is there's often a mismatch between seed supply and demand. Most of us will know that seed supplies already offer a diverse range of different varieties to 4 different market segments. So what you see in the diagram on the side, for example, is actual distribution of sales of different varieties according to different seasons. On the left side, in rather dry seasons, you would see in the bottom part, there's a much higher sales of early maturing varieties than in rainy seasons. That's because farmers will demand different varieties in different, under different climate outcomes. But the tricky part here is that many farmers will make that decision right at the beginning of the season. So in your experience, you will have seen that farmers will often wait for the beginning of the season When rains are late, they'll buy short duration crops. When rains are early, they'll buy long duration crops. But the problem is that at that moment, the supply decisions, what is packaged, what is put in stores, what is cleaned and so on, is already made by the seed suppliers. Next slide, please. And this causes the mismatches. So often, seed suppliers will choose sort of an average strategy to minimize both oversupply, having to transport back seed that is not sold, and undersupply, which obviously is not in the interest of seed companies, because farmers will go to a competitor or just be dissatisfied with the seed supplier. So next slide, please. So what we see is that many seed suppliers will kind of choose this average strategy, something in between the dry portfolio and the wet portfolio. But next slide, please. This will still basically in all situations lead to some undersupply and some oversupply, which has economic costs for the seed supplier. So what we've been wondering is whether and how seasonal forecasts, which are now publicly available and have reasonable predictive power, how they can be used to improve this seed supply planning to better match farmers' demand. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea what we mean by seasonal scenario planning, this is a super simple example of scenario planning that we all do in our daily lives. So the example here is you go to the market and you know there's an 85% probability it's not going to rain, but there is also a 15% probability it will rain. So what do you do? Next slide, please. Will you take an umbrella or not? There's a high risk of carrying an umbrella for nothing and your arm will be tired and so on. There's also a low risk you will get wet if you don't take an umbrella. So please, we'll come back to that later. In the poll now, make your decision. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just to demonstrate that seasonal scenario plan or scenario planning in general is something we all do in our daily lives, kind of balancing different risks and coming to a decision that balances these risks. Next slide, please. And how do we implement seasonal scenario planning in seed supply? So basically, there are these 4 steps that we're considering. First one is becoming aware of what are the drivers of uncertainty. Next, we've worked with a seed supplier, Seedco Limited in Zimbabwe. Dean Mungani will speak on the board later on. Next, please. And we've seen that basically in Zimbabwe, the main drivers of uncertainty of seed demand is overall seasonal rainfall, but also elections. Elections also play a role because political parties will often hand out seed to smallholder farmers, and that will affect whether and how and what they demand, what's their seed demand on the commercial market. The next step is envisioning what are the alternative scenarios. So we have basically 3 seasonal scenarios: wet, average, and dry, and election, no election. So that gives 6 different scenarios that a seed supplier can prepare for. Next, please. And we can also predict the probability of each scenario. So with seasonal forecasts, climate forecasts that are available now, we can say up to 6 months in advance, we can already say, well, it's looking like it's going to be a rather wet season. So there's a 45% chance of a rather wet season and only a 25% probability of a rather dry season. Then based on these considerations, the idea is to take risk minimizing decisions. So it would not be economically wise to go for a fully wet portfolio and minimize the supply of early maturing varieties, because there still is a chance it will be a dry season. But probably the economically smart solution would be to move your portfolio slightly into the wet portfolio range. So, and this is what we're trying to suggest. Next slide, please. So we've developed a procedure based on 3 major inputs that are needed. So first of all, we use the CHIRPS dataset. This is a freely available, globally gridded dataset of rainfall estimates back decades into the past for any location in the world. And that helps us to categorize past seasons into, was it a dry, average, or wet season for any location you're interested in. Next step is the seed supplier using our procedure would need to supply some demand data. What did farmers demand in the past season? And that allows us, or allows the user, the seed supplier, to correlate seasonal rainfall and seasonal demand. So how is demand really different between wet seasons and dry seasons? And then the next step is accessing a publicly available seasonal climate forecast. So the small figure I've added here is actually a screenshot for the seasonal climate now in July, August, September, where we can basically get these numbers that I've showed before. 45% wet, 25% dry, and so on. And all of this feeds into an Excel workbook that does all the calculations and gives you an output, gives the user an output in terms of recommendations, where to move your portfolio. Should you package a bit more of the early maturing varieties, a bit more of the dry, of the long duration crops, and so on. Next slide, please. But then this workbook should not be the holy grail that determines the seed supply decisions, of course. This is embedded in a team exercise. Next, please. It has basically 3 steps. So first of all, a team of staff at a seed supplier convenes and discusses seed scenario planning and defines these major scenarios. So what we found out in Zimbabwe, elections, no elections. In other countries, in other contexts, completely different factors might play a role. Then the next step is feeding this Excel tool with data when available, or possibly even estimates. Often people working at a seed supplier will know the tendencies, at least, even in situations where the exact data of seed demand is not available. And then the third step, the most important step, is discussing the implications. All right, so we know we're expecting a rather so-and-so, rather dry-leaning season. We expect these implications for seed demand. So what do we do? What changes do we undertake in our economic operations? This is what we call the scenario responses. Next slide, please. Right, I think, yeah, I've almost come to the end of my presentation. So what we want to achieve today is basically to discuss with our panelists that I'll present, that I'll introduce soon, but also with you, the audience. We would like to hear also from you how you believe seasonal scenario planning can be applied by different types of seed suppliers, by companies, but also by government programs or NGOs. We're interested in what stages of the seed supply chain can be best improved with scenario planning. Do you think seasonal scenario planning would be most useful at the packaging stage, or at the distribution stage, or for pricing, advertising, and so on? Different responses are possible, of course. And then what do you think, what should be the outputs of the whole procedure and the actual workbook? So there are different ways in which this tool can actually inform decision making, but we're interested in what types of outputs you'd be most interested in as experts working in the seed sector. So these questions will pop up later again, just to present to you what we're looking for today. Next, please. This is my last slide before moving on to my colleague Bertha. We're just interested now in who is basically in the audience. So what sector do you work in? That will be tremendously useful for us to understand who the responses we're getting today are coming from. Thank you very much. Bertha, up to you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. Yeah, so my name is Bertha, and I'm working together with Jonathan in the Alliance, and we have been working together in this project. So I just would like to explain to you shortly the methodology we have used in all this process. So we have used a design framework that is called user-centered design. So next one, please, James. So, okay, what is user-centered design? It is a design framework that helps to understand existing needs of users, to select matching technologies, and to adapt them with feedback from those users. It is an iterative process in which the users of the tool are actively involved, and the final outcome is shaped by the needs of these users. So now I'm going to walk you through the typical steps of this process. So the first one, analysis. Users are consulted to understand which issues they are facing. So based on this, we move to the next one, conception. And oh, wait a minute. Okay, so here the design team comes together and they draft possible options that may be the solution to the problem that users are facing. In the next step, the design phase, these possible solutions are presented with, represented with different versions or prototypes and are further tested with users. And then finally, the tool or service is tested in a pilot project and further redefined. So these different phases of the process can be repeated as many times as needed until an optimal solution to the problem is found, and it's not a circular process. So you can do analysis, conception, move back to analysis, then conception, design, and so on. So next one, please. So, okay, now how did we apply this framework to our project? For this project about seasonal scenario planning, our initial goal was to develop a tool that would address a problem that a lot of seed producers face, that is a mismatch between supply and demand of seed. And then we just started to think how we could address this issue in the future with an easy to use tool that anybody without much expertise could use. And here is where we come up with the idea of having some sort of Excel-based tool. So we started to do research with one of our partners, Sitcom in Zimbabwe. So first in the analysis phase, we talked to them and to try to find out which factors affect seed demand and supply. And for example, we found out that besides rainfall, elections are important and affect a lot seed demand. So then we came together, me and Jonathan, and we started to think how we could correlate those factors as rainfall or elections to seed demand. And we worked with different data and models to correlate them. So then in the design phase, we created a first prototype of the Excel tool. And yeah, this one had like some complex steps, and it was providing numeric results. And we tested it with Sitco, and we got a lot of inputs for its further improvement. And actually, this tool was improved, and now the version that Jonathan presented in the introductory video is the one we have at the moment. So at the moment, we are at the design phase of the tool. And today we would like to keep on testing the tool with you and gathering some further feedback for its improvement. So I hope that will be the case, and we will have an enriching discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Berta. We'll now move on to a panel discussion with three key people who have been part of this design and development process. Before I'll introduce the panelists, though, I'd like to ask one question to the audience. This is the next poll question, James. Please, from your experience in your different countries, the sectors you work with, I think this is the one question. Which stages in the seed supply chain at which stages would be most beneficial to know demand in advance? You may select only one answer or two, or please maximum of three, don't select all of them. We'd be most interested in what would be the most appropriate target of this scenario planning process. Thank you very much for making your decision. We'll now move on to a panel. We have here with us Dean Mungani, who is now with IITA in Nigeria, but was previously senior maize breeder and head of product development with Seedco Limited, one of the largest maize seed producers in Africa. So, next person here is Marlene Kretschmer. Marlene is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading, where she works on seasonal forecasts. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Jacob van Etten, who is the Research Director for Digital Inclusion at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and SEAT, and who is also working on other digital tools for seed supply, and who will be able to tell us how this might integrate with other tools. So thank you very much, everybody, for your availability. Thanks for being here. I'd like to start perhaps with Dean. Here's my questions. Dean, you are now with IITA, but you were with SEEDCO before, and you've been part of this problem assessment phase of this design process. Could you tell us from your perspective as previous member of a commercial seed provider, where do you think seasonal scenario planning would be most beneficial, economically speaking, in a seed supply organization?
I think the biggest challenge you're facing as seed production enterprise is you want to produce seed for selling next year, but you're not sure of the scenarios that will take place next year. So production is very key. How do you plan your production? Because there are many things that fit into that production phase. There's also parent seed that fits into that production cycle. So you want to make sure you optimize, because you don't want to oversupply certain varieties and undersupply certain varieties. So the only way to do that is to plan your production well. Obviously, there are many things that will impact your production as well, because even if you target to produce more of seed of a certain product, drought still affects you, other crop pests still affect your crop, which will also reduce the amount of seed that is going to be available. And the responses differ with each variety. So I think the critical stage is the production planning. And then obviously packaging is a choice you make with whatever is available and the scenarios that are playing at that particular moment. Normally we see this packaged from around April in Zimbabwe, because the seed sales normally they start around October to December. The peak season for selling is between October and December. So packaging starts between April and October. So at that stage, packaging can adapt to these scenarios, but production is not easy to then adjust.
All right, thank you very much, Dean. I'm quite happy to have Marlene here with us as the climate scientist. If I understand correctly, Dean, production would happen 12 months in advance, so basically in the season of the previous year, while packaging would happen just a few months before actual seed distribution to the farmers. Marlene, could you say something about the lead time that's possible right now with seasonal forecasts? If I understand right, a 12-month forecast is not actually technically feasible at the moment.
Yeah, thanks and for the introduction, and was really interesting, and hi everybody. So maybe just a very general note of why this is so difficult, kind of making these forecasts on these long lead ranges. It's really the time scale we are talking about is between weather and climate. So it's also different climate models or weather forecast models we use. And let's say the physical problems we solve are different. Typical weather forecast, what we mean is, let's say 10 days in advance. So the kind of forecast we use every day. We mainly use the information from the atmosphere, the initial conditions in the atmosphere. So what is the pressure like? What are the winds like? And then we can make these forecasts. But the scale then just very suddenly drop. When we talk about forecasts beyond weather forecasts, so let's say a month ahead or a season ahead or even a year ahead or a decade ahead, then the information which make the forecast skillful, ideally, they come from more slowly moving boundary conditions from the ocean, from the soil moisture, from sea ice conditions. So all these things in the atmosphere, things in the components in the climate system which move more slowly. So just let's say, also to say why there are these differences in skill. And then skill gets lost. It's harder to predict things. But the good news is that there are some things which give rise to skillful forecasts. And it's true that beyond, or let's say 1 year ahead, is a very difficult timescale. But it doesn't mean that there cannot be anything there. So my point is, I think that the difficult thing is to make a very specific forecast 1 year ahead for every year, for every region around the globe, and especially for precipitation. This is difficult to predict. So I think the optimal strategy, or let's say the potential, is to find the relevant drivers and find the relevant things relevant to a user, and then one can, let's say, squeeze some more signal out of the system. But it's hard to make, let's say, a generic map of a skillful forecast. So, but it's not to say that there is not, let's say, more potential for more useful forecasts, especially when one is interested in summary statistics. Let's say, if it's, let's say, above precipitation above average over a certain season or year. But making, let's say, 12 months ahead a prediction of a particular month, this is very limited in skill. But there are, let's say, there are more possibilities which we can maybe talk about. Right. For example, using information of something like the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which I'm sure some have heard before. So these can give rise to some more skill.
Right, thank you very much, Marlene. You said identifying the drivers that matter for the user. I'd like to bounce that question further to Dean for a second. Dean, what in seedco or in commercial seed suppliers, what kind of information would be used to make these decisions about production, about packaging, and so on? So how are these decisions currently made?
Yeah, currently it's a hit and miss, mostly because, like I said, the year you're producing is the year you are selling. So normally marketing, it's kind of a replacement strategy to say which variety is running out faster. So at times they adjust. So they'll have a production plan well ahead of time, but this is adjusted as the season goes, depending on the way the sales are going. So if one variety is running out faster, so there's also adjustment to replace it. But again, this then changes completely when the actual seed sales happen the following year. I remember at one time we had to offer incentives as farmers started returning late maturing products because the season started very late and it was no longer practical or feasible for the farmers to continue. So we had to give them incentives that if you buy this late material, you win this and you win that. Or it was a way to try and make sure that the farmers could. So I think the key driver, I mean, at the moment, it's a big task. It's a huge call and requirement for many seed companies to have, especially in a scenario where you have to produce 12 months before. So this tool is a very important tool for production. It's easier for larger enterprises, but more difficult for smaller, because I would say the bigger companies can also adapt because they will be operating in different environments or different countries with different environment regime, so they can move around the seeds. But again, there's also a risk. The markets, there was also government policies that can also restrict movement of seeds. There's a time, I think in Zambia, there was a restriction to move seed out of Zambia. Yet there's a demand in certain markets. So those are some of the assumptions or conditionalities that have to be made.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for the insight, Dean. I'd like to take this opportunity to also ask a question to the audience. So our next question would be, what are the factors that affect seed demand for different crop varieties in your region? We know that you are from all parts of the world, especially Africa, of course. So what factors, in addition to what we already said, seasonal rainfall, elections, but what else might drive farmer seed demand in your context? So James has posted that question in the chat. Thank you very much. Please respond in the chat. Next question goes to Jakob. So we've presented today, but also in the video that we've posted beforehand, we've presented our procedure as implemented in an Microsoft Excel tool. So the idea behind that was, we don't want to develop a new app or a new website, something new, but we just want to have a technology that people are already using, right? So Microsoft Excel is something that most people working in seed supply organizations would already be familiar with. And that's why we implemented this whole procedure, the whole calculations in Microsoft Excel. But we invited you to give a perspective on the wider digital ecosystem driving seed supply. Where else do you see seasonal scenario planning could be integrated, perhaps with other digital tools, with other available digital services?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. And thanks for the really nice presentation as well. So I think there's like two pieces. So one is the information kind of coming from upstream. So the whole, the breeding process up to the point where we make decisions about seed production, but then the more downstream process of actual seed production and marketing. So there are a number of tools that could connect on both sides with this kind of tool. And then there's also broader frameworks that people are working on right now. And I think it's also important to look at these broader frameworks. So there's some work going on in the CGIAR with Syngenta Foundation to come up with a framework for product design and management that will then hopefully become the new standard to do that whole process. And Dean now is one of the product managers in the CGIAR. I will be very familiar with that. And so that is not ready yet, but hopefully we can look at how we can integrate this into that wider process. So that's more the kind of the upstream bit, like how breeding actually works, how the goals are then defined, and how could then feed into this with kind of the characteristics of the varieties that could be useful, whatever we know about their traits that are affected by different climate scenarios and other types of things that drive seasonal scenarios. It could be other things than climate. And then also downstream. So there are tools like Seed Tracker tool that IATA is making. There are a couple of other tools in that area as well, where we could look at linkages and seeing how we can integrate this. So I think it's useful now to have this first step, more conceptual step. That's great. And I think this is the right time to actually look at those linkages as we move into the new one CGIAR from our perspective. Because people are now actively thinking about these frameworks and how things should work in the future. It's a very important next step, I think, for this design process. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Yes, I'd like to also ask the audience, if you have any questions to the panelists, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat, or your comments that you would like to make on this process. And the next question will go to Marlene. When speaking to farmers, basically farmers in most cases will not be aware of seasonal rainfall overall. What they see is onset date, right? So farmers would know rains are early, rains are late, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a rain abundant season or a dry season. Can you say something about predicting onset date? Is that something that can be done with similar skill as seasonal rainfall?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, unfortunately, one, hard to give like a yes or no answer. So maybe first of all, there is not really just one measure of skill. So it's always really kind of, let's say, the goodness of forecast is really user dependent. And it's actually really great to be here to hear about user needs, because this, let's say, often a perspective we climate scientists lack, and we don't really know what is needed or what is considered useful. And this can be really different depending on context. So depends on what you want, and let's say the best way to find out is probably for climate scientists and users to talk to each other and find out what one side can provide and what the other side needs, and probably find something meet in the middle. And so yes, I think depending on or this has to be, let's say, explored in more detail, or indeed if how onset is predicted by the models. And where then a second possibility is, let's say, to see what we as climate scientists know about the drivers, let's say physical, the climatic drivers of onset date, and whether we can get other ways to, let's say, predict it beyond the models. And what I mean by this is we have, of course, ways to do post-processing of model outputs. We can also combine physical knowledge with dynamical model forecasts. So it's, again, it's it can be for the targeted variable. There are other ways to make a forecast better beyond what the model predicts. And this is, of course, something what we do all the time in terms of bias reductions, post-processing of model outputs, and so on. But it's really target specific, I'd say. And let's say for me, as the climate scientist perspective, it would really be understanding what drives the onset, and again, what are these climatic patterns in the ocean which are relevant for this, or in the atmosphere, and see where the model predicts this. So yeah, again, would have to be decided by application case.
All right, so basically the next step would go from this fairly generic process to something through more closer collaboration between the actual user and the climate scientist, developing a more context-specific solution.
So this would be, let's say, my take on this, and just to not to, let's say, to delusionize about this approach. And I guess also one strength is the simplicity, and that it's so straightforward and publicly available. But I do think, let's say, that we as climate scientists can do more than just provide these maps which are produced operationally and automatically. But this requires, of course, more work from the climate scientist side, and to understand what's needed and what can be done. So yeah, so I think actually there is room for improvement in a good sense, but this doesn't mean, of course, that there's lack of skill already, or what is provided already. And maybe just if I have 1 second, we should also not forget that there's, of course, the climate change component, which could affect the strength of this forecast model. I mean, or the big challenge we have as climate scientists is that the data we have is not stationary in time, so it changes, or signals or the trends can change. So if something was like this in the past, doesn't mean it has to be there in the future. And especially for East Africa, there's something what we call the paradox, that the models tend to project more wettening, but the observations show more like a weakening of the rains or less rain. And so understanding this really, requires more work, let's say, from our side. But of course, this is also my biased climate science perspective.
Well, that's what we invited you for. So thanks for giving this account. Yeah. Right. So we have another question, an interesting question from the audience from Michael Peters, whether this tool or this procedure mainly targets annual species, as with perennial species, seasonal variation would have different implications. So my brief answer would be that this is targeting annual species, although seed demand for perennial species might also be driven by seasonal scenarios, but more long-range seasonal projections. That's what I would say. But I would also like to get Jacob's opinion on this, as I know Jacob is working on demand for planting material for cocoa in Ghana. Jacob, do you see any potential for using seasonal, so really just immediate next season predictions for perennial crop?
Yeah, that's quite difficult, but I do think it's interesting. That's actually, there you get a lead time that is much longer, right? If it's in terms of climate for crops, so also the breeding cycles are much longer. So even there, you could think about climate prediction as one way to guide breeding. So that's also something that we're looking at. So for example, if the frequency of dry years will increase in the future, according to the climate models, you could say, let's breed for drier varieties and give that more weight in the selection process, for example. But then also even for seed production. So for example, in Ghana, what the government is doing, they have full control over what goes into farmers' fields in a way, because they kind of determine the mixes of varieties that are handed out to farmers as seedlings. So that is a very kind of controllable process that could be made very rational the decisions about the mix that is handed out to farmers. So there, almost all of the stages of seed production, the national state-owned system makes decisions. So that could be an interesting use case actually for climate models, because you have this much longer lead time in contrast with annual crops. Yeah. I hadn't thought about it actually.
Thank you very much. Dean, you've been working on maize, but is there anything you would like to add on perennial crops? I believe you have some expertise with perennial crops as well.
No. I think my crops have been just general annual crops, maize.
All right, sorry.
I think it still applies because depending on when you produce and when you make it available, the planning is much easier if you're going to produce within the same year and then supply it within the same year. At least the forecasts are way better. The biggest problem comes where you have to produce previous year and then supply the following year. So because there are huge costs, because you have to pay the growers don't care whether you're going to sell or not. And what you agree in the contract, you have to pay them. So that can have huge implications on the enterprise in terms of economics. So you have to do the planning very well, because an overstock of a certain product means at times it's a make or break situation for many companies. Like I was saying, the bigger ones, they can adapt by spreading. So I think it still applies whether perennial or seasonal crop. The tools still apply, and because the huge factor is mostly you are not going to use your own resources like land. You're going to contract other people with other business goals as well. So at times you have to pay for them before you sell.
All right, thank you very much, Dean. I think this is the moment to ask another question to the audience, our last question. Dear audience, you've heard now much about seasonal scenario plans. Where do you see opportunities for using seasonal scenario planning in your work? It might be along the lines of what we've been discussing here, or maybe you have a completely new idea of how seasonal scenario planning could be beneficial for your work. We've seen there are a lot of researchers here in the audience, but also quite some people from the private sector. So please, anything that you think could be useful for your work, please write it in the chat box. Thank you very much. We have, how much time do we have left? We have another 8 minutes, perfect. Jakob, I have another question to you. Just as I mentioned, we have people from different sectors here. We have researchers, we have people from NGOs, from public institutions as well. So we have been designing this tool with a private company in mind. We've been working together with Seedco, with Dean. But what other sectors do you think seasonal scenario planning could be useful for? I'm just guessing extension agents could make use of that information to recommend different varieties to farmers, for instance. So what other ideas do you have?
Yes, so private sector with Seedco, that is a very interesting entry point. Then, of course, a public seed sector. So for example, the one from Ghana that I mentioned is a very interesting one, actually. And I think that also just formalizing that process of the decision making with a scenario planning approach would be very interesting. So we've been talking quite a bit about the climate and the kind of probabilities that you could put into the system. That's, I think, one aspect, but just also the fact that you formalize the process, even if you don't have very good data to put kind of probabilities on each of the scenarios. I think just preparing a scenario and thinking through what would happen if X happens is a general business good practice tool, right? So that you're prepared. That's not every year you're kind of improvising again, because every year it's again not average, right? It's never average. So you're prepared for that. And then if it's again not average, you know, you have already prepared the actions, what to do. You have agreements in place with your partners or within your organization. So you kind of follow a kind of a playbook, right? People do this in normal business operations all the time. Also in emergency responses, usually that happens. You have a playbook ready. You don't know what is going to happen. And the problem is actually when people throw the playbooks out of the window, so to say, and then problems start. It's not so much the issue that that average situations don't occur, because that's normal. So we need to be good at playing with this variation, and that's normal in agriculture. So I think that's a principle that is applicable across the board in private sector and in any part of the seed system. And we realize much more now how interconnected all the seed systems are, also more with the informal sector. So there as well, these kinds of mechanisms to explore what would we do if this happens, what would we do if that happens, and just putting together kind of consistent scenarios, I think is very useful. And maybe that's also a role for climate science. It's maybe not so much to put probabilities on things, but maybe to say, if this occurs, it's also very likely that this other thing occurs. So you can put together consistent scenarios. It's just thinking a little bit beyond the kind of the probability type of question there. So I think that if it's like with these principles in mind, I think it's a very applicable method across many sectors. And I think this has been a very interesting exercise. I think it kind of asks for more, right? So maybe not just saying, okay, how can we now use the tool, but how can we also use the principles of scenario planning across the seed sector? Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jakob. And that links perfectly to the last question we asked to the audience. And I see answers rolling in. Berta, you're managing the chat. Can you give just a brief overview of what people have been saying about how they could use seasonal scenario planning in their work?
Yeah, sure. So we have somebody working in a gene bank that, for example, he thinks it could be very useful for planning for regeneration activities. Also, Martha works with annual crops, and she thinks this seasonal scenario planning will help for better support to local seed companies to coordinate seed production. And then also, Nadia thinks that this can help organizations to minimize risks. So yeah, this is some of the answers we have gotten to this question.
All right, perfect. Thank you. According to the plan, we have 3 minutes to go. Before we wrap up, is there any question from the audience that we should address? No problem if there isn't. Hi, James. So I'd like to give the final words to the panel. Marlene, Jakob, Dean, would you each like to make a final statement on maybe what you've learned or what you think would be the next steps for this procedure? Maybe let's start with Marlene.
Yeah, no, it was really interesting. Well, thanks again for all these impressions. Also, the last statement by Jakob was really interesting for me to see, let's say, this consistency planning, or I don't know how you called it directly, but I understood what you meant. So for me, definitely the take-home message is to listen better to what people need, and maybe just to say there's also lots of ongoing research activities and different projects where research scientists and stakeholders work together. So I could just encourage to search on the internet and reach out to climate scientists and to search for these projects. So this timescale and this forecasting between weather and climate, this is becoming bigger and bigger, and so much more research is dedicated to that. So I really hope we can make progress on this respect, but it will require a lot of work from all sides, I guess. But yeah, I think improvements are definitely possible.
Awesome. Thank you, Marlene. Dean, do you have some final words? No problem if you don't, but
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, thank you so much for including me in this work. Thanks, Better, as well. What I also wanted to add was this is key, not just for private, but also for the public. I mean, for governments to plan how to move relief in the following seasons. Even, I mean, not just national governments, but also like international, like, I mean, the World Food Program, where they can move around based on the forecast that will be coming. I saw my colleague Chris mentioned about linking scenario planning with demand. I think this is all about putting together a demand plan, and then it also helps in terms of planning the early generation seeds. So it's very critical that optimize these things and reduce waste and maximize efficiencies. So it also, in terms of seed companies, they can also within country, they can also design a plan in terms of where to supply, in terms of their route to market, where to supply more, where to undersupply certain. So all these scenarios, they optimize in terms of profitability for the private sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean. Jakob, I really liked your idea about having these reasonable playbooks. What if this occurs, then that is also likely to occur, and we can expand our seasonal scenario plannings beyond mere climate. Would you like to add a final statement?
Yes, no, that would, I think that's an interesting, like a research question. Can we get to these what people call consistent scenarios? So some things are just not likely to happen at the same or in the same season, right? So that's maybe an interesting way to look in a different way at climate science rather than just asking for a forecast. What is the likelihood of co-occurrence of, if it's a short season, and maybe also the average rainfall, the total rainfall would be lower maybe. So there are a number of things that kind of co-occur together where we could look at. And then what I think you asked about next steps, and maybe also in more general terms, I think it's interesting to look at how can the principle for scenario planning with this nice case study in our hand, how maybe we could initiate a conversation with those that are working on the kind of the streamlining of the breeding process within the CGIAR, for example, the product management cycle, where people trying to put together a number of these tools as well. So what can this inspire that work? And then also a number of conversations about integration with with software that already exists. So the good thing is that you haven't really invested in like big software development, and so maybe the next step right now is not to build a tool per se that is more formal than the Excel spreadsheet that you have, but first to explore what is going on already around us. And there's a lot of things going on very quickly. So when you started planning this project a bit over a year ago, there's not the same software environment than what we have now. So it's really good to connect again and see what is happening and see how this tool can contribute to what is going on. And I can help in that, Jonathan.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jakob. I think we've run a bit late. James, thank you for closing the session. Thanks everybody on the panel. Thanks for the strong attendance in the audience. And we see that about 2/3 of people would not take an umbrella, although 1/3 would take an umbrella. So the optimal solution would be to take 1/3 of an umbrella according to our scenario. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you very much to everybody in the panel. Yeah, indeed, we forgot to share the results of this earlier on. My apologies, but nice that we can have a look at it now to close off the session. Okay, great. Really interesting, guys, and a really nice presentation of tool and development and its application. So thanks a lot, and wishing you the very best with the next steps of development. Curious to see when we can all get our hands on it, of course. Okay, it's due time to move forward. Now on the screen, unfortunately, our audience, you have again to make a choice as to where you go next. Here we're going to have a great discussion on analyzing fragile seed contexts with our colleagues from Mercy Corps and seedsystem.org. Alternatively, you can also click the link that's now coming into the chat, if I can just find the chat box here. And you'll have a very engaging discussion on policy entrepreneurship as a game changer for seed sector transformation. And that's with colleagues from Wageningen University and 1 or 2 more people I do believe are joining. That's it for now. We will get started promptly in about 6 minutes. Thank you and see you soon.